Cowboy's old father lay dying in a burning cabin. A stranger woman pulled him out and gained a son. The smoke hit me before I even cleared the ridge. Not the good kind, not cook fire or tobacco or a chimney breathing on a cold night. This was the other kind. Black and rolling, the kind that grabs the back of your throat and won't let go. I pulled Duster up hard and he was already spooked, ears pinned flat and dancing sideways under me. I'd been 3 days out from the ranch, pushing 40 head of half-wild cattle back toward the Heller Range, and the whole ride home I'd had that itchy feeling between my shoulder blades that a man gets when something isn't right, and he can't name it yet. I named it then. The cabin was my father's, had been for 31 years. He built it with his own hands in the summer of 1861, the year the whole country went to war and he was too old to go and had to live with that. He told me once, because he was not a man given to repeating himself, that he built that cabin the way he wished he'd built himself. Straight, sound, nothing extra, nothing wasted. He was proud of it the way a man is proud of a thing he made alone, without help, and it had stood through wind and drought and 2 hard winters that killed cattle by the hundreds. It was burning. I put my heels into Duster and he went, because a good horse will go when you ask even if he's afraid, which is more than I can say for most men I've ridden with. We came down that ridge at a pace that wasn't wise on that kind of slope, and I was already calling out, "Pa, pa, pa," like the word itself could hold back the smoke. What I saw when I got to the yard stopped me cold. There was a woman I did not know dragging my father out through the front door. Not helping him walk, dragging. She had him under the arms, his boots leaving 2 parallel furrows in the dirt, and her face was set in that particular way a person's face gets when they've made a decision that doesn't have room in it for any other thought. Her hat was gone. Her hair, brown, cut short for a woman, barely past her jaw, was full of ash. There was a burn on her left forearm that I didn't know about yet. She didn't look up when I came thundering into the yard. She just kept pulling. I was off Duster before he stopped moving. I got to her in 3 strides and took my father's weight, and we got him another 20 feet from the cabin to the water trough, and I set him down against it with his back to the wood. He was breathing, ragged and wet-sounding, but breathing. I straightened up and looked at her for the first time. She was looking at my father, not at me. She had her hands on her knees and was breathing hard, and she had the look of someone who has just put something heavy down that they were not going to put down no matter what. She was maybe 35, maybe 40, hard to say. Her face had been in weather. There was a thinness to her jaw, the kind that comes not from lack of eating but from years of something. She had dark eyes, brown or near black, and there was a rope burn on her right hand so old and thick it looked like a brand. I said, "Who are you?" She said, "Your father needs water, not your questions." She was right. I turned and worked the pump and soaked my bandana and pressed it to his face, and she was already at his collar, loosening it, her fingers quick and sure. His name was Everett Cal. He was 68 years old and he had been working cattle since he was 12, and he had never once in my memory asked for help from anyone. He opened his eyes when the wet cloth touched his face, and he looked at me and he said, with some effort, "Roof beam." The cabin went up while we were crouched there beside him. Not all at once. It sort of folded in on itself, first the near corner of the roof, then the whole thing shuddering and settling, the wall timbers going red and then gone. 31 years of his work, his good straight walls, the 2 rifles he kept above the door, the photograph of my mother that he'd had for 15 years since she died and that I'd never once seen him put away. Gone, all of it. He watched it, he didn't say anything. He just watched it with the expression of a man who has made his accounting and found it in order and has nothing left to explain. My name is Cade Everett Cal. I was 38 years old that summer and I thought I knew what loss looked like. I'd been through enough of it. I watched my father watch his cabin burn, and I understood right then that I had not known the half of it. Her name was Nora Birch. She told me that while we were building a lean-to out of the only thing left standing, the old pole corral on the east side of the yard, to get my father out of the afternoon sun. She'd been riding through. She had a little gray mare that she kept her supplies on, and she was heading north, and the cabin had been on fire when she found it. "He was inside," she said. She handed me one end of a crossbowl, and I wedged it into the fork of the upright, and she was already moving to the other side without being told. "I called out first," she said. Nobody answered. I could hear him coughing. "I thought about that." A strange woman on a strange horse, smoke pouring out of a building, and she went in. "You could have died," I said. "Could have," she said, and that was all. She didn't say it like she was brave. She said it like she was stating a plain fact about weather. We got the lean-to up, and I moved my father into the shade of it, and she brought her canteen over and set it within his reach, and he thanked her, my father, who thanked almost no one for almost nothing in his life. And she nodded once the way you nod at something that is the natural order of things. I should have asked her to stay then, I know that now. Instead, I went to check on the cattle. They'd scattered when I left them, and I needed to know how many I'd lost. And when I came back an hour later, she'd made a fire and had coffee on and was sitting on her bedroll a little way from my father, not talking, just present. He was asleep. I sat down across from the fire. She handed me a cup. I took it. "You ride alone?" I asked. "Most of the time." "Where are you headed?" "North," she said again. "Town called Harlow. I've got a sister there." "That's 4 days from here." "I know." The coffee was good, better than I made, which wasn't saying much. The fire was small and built right, fed just enough to keep going and no more. I said he'd have died. She didn't answer for a moment. Then she said, probably. "So you saved him." She looked at the fire. "Helped him get out, that's different." But it wasn't different, and I think she knew it and just had some reason not to claim it. I let it lie. My father slept through the night. Nora Birch slept on the other side of the fire, and I sat up watching the embers and listening to him breathe, and I thought about a great many things, not all of them things I could name. He was worse in the morning. The smoke had done something to his lungs that one night's sleep wasn't going to fix. He was breathing shallow and quick, and there was a sound in it, a wet catch that I didn't like at all. He ate a little. She'd made something with dried corn and a strip of salt pork that he got most of down. And then he lay back and he looked at the sky above the lean-to and he said, "Cade." "Yeah, that woman saved me." "She did." He was quiet, then he said, "She should stay till I'm on my feet." That was about as long a speech as my father made on most subjects. I looked at Nora Birch, who was pretending to reorganize her saddlebag in a way that made clear she'd heard every word. She looked up at me. I said, "He's right. He needs a few days before he can be moved. I'd be obliged if you'd stay." She thought about it, or she looked like she was thinking about it. I had the sense then, and I was right. I came to know that later, that she'd already decided before I asked. "A few days," she said. Those few days stretched. Not because my father got worse, he didn't. He got slowly, grudgingly better, which was the only way he did anything, but because she was useful in ways I hadn't expected and she didn't make a noise about any of it. She knew how to clean a burn. She knew how to rig a canvas shelter against afternoon wind. She knew how to boil water in a way that took out the grit that turned a man's stomach on the 3rd day. She'd seen hard country was the thing. You could see it in everything she did. The economy of it, no wasted motion, no asking what came next. On the 3rd day, I rode into McGuire's Crossing, which was the nearest town, about 11 miles east. I needed lumber to start rebuilding, and I needed to send word to my foreman, Sam Briggs, who'd be wondering where I was with those cattle. When I got back, 3 hours before dark with a wagon full of rough-sawn pine, my father was sitting upright and Nora Birch was on her bedroll with a piece of saddle leather and an awl, doing some repair, and they were talking. My father talking. My father, who had once gone 4 days without saying a word to me that I counted as conversation. Not because we were angry, just because there wasn't anything he needed to say, and he was not the kind of man to fill silence for the sake of it, was talking to this woman like he'd been saving it up. I unloaded the wagon quietly. I couldn't hear what they were saying. I didn't try. I just listened to the sounds of it, the back and forth, and something in my chest did a thing it hadn't done in a long while. I'd been married once. I don't suppose that's news to anyone who's reached my age with any kind of life behind them. Her name was Della. She came from Missouri, from farming people, and she came out to this country full of faith in what it could be, and the country paid her back for that faith the way it pays back everyone. She died in the winter of '79. Childbed fever. The baby, too, a boy we'd already named, which I sometimes think was the particular cruelty of it, that we'd given him a name and then he didn't need it. After that, I threw myself into work the way men throw themselves into rivers. because moving is easier than standing still and thinking. I was good at my work. I knew cattle the way some men know horses or timber from the bone out. I could read the weather and the color of the sky an hour before the glass would tell you, and I could find water in country that looked like it had nothing to offer, and I never asked for a man's help that I couldn't pay back. That steadiness, that competence, it kept me alive, and it kept the ranch running, and it kept me a kind of company after a fashion. But a man can be good at work and still know, in the place behind his ribs, that he's running from something. I'd been running for 8 years by the time Nora Birch dragged my father out of a burning building. She stayed a week. Then she stayed another week while we got the foundation laid for the new cabin, and she helped me pull posts and didn't once pretend that it was outside her ability, which it wasn't. She was strong, not in the obvious way, but in the way that a good rope is strong, never jerking, just holding. My father sat on an overturned bucket and supervised, which was a thing he was better at than most. On the Saturday of the second week, she made biscuits from flour she had in her pack, and we ate them with sorghum while the sun went down behind the bluffs, and my father said they were the best biscuits he'd had since my mother died, and that was more than he'd said about my mother in 8 years. She looked at him. Something passed over her face, not sadness exactly, something more like recognition. "She made good ones," Nora asked him. "Fool woman used too much lard," he said. "These are better." I watched her try not to smile. She didn't go on Sunday like I half expected her to. She just didn't mention going. On Monday, I rode out to check the north fence, which had been down since July, and I asked her if she wanted to come, thinking she'd say no, thinking she had work to do at camp. She said yes before I finished the sentence. We rode most of the morning in the kind of silence that isn't uncomfortable. Duster and her gray, she called him Pontiac, which I asked about once, and she said it was a long story, and I said I had a long day, and she said she'd tell me sometime, which she did much later, and it was worth waiting for. We found the fence, and I worked the wire while she held the post, and I showed her the way I did it, with 2 raps before you twist, and she watched once and then did it herself on the next post, and it was cleaner than mine. I said, "You learn fast." She said, "I've been learning things on the fly my whole life." She said it easy, no weight on it, but I heard the weight. There was something about her that afternoon, the way she moved in country, reading it the way I read it, noting the same things, the tracks of something along the creek bed, the way the grass bent that meant cattle had been through 2 days ago. She knew country, not as a thing to pass through, but as a thing to be in. I asked her about her people. She said her father had been a trapper, had taken her into the mountains when she was 9, after her mother died. She'd learned things in the mountains that you could not learn anywhere else, and then he died too, on a winter crossing, when she was 17, and she'd come out the other side of the mountains alone and had been making her way since. "That's why you went in," I said. I wasn't looking at her. I was looking at the fence line. "What do you mean?" "The cabin, my father. You knew what it was to have the one person left go, and you weren't willing to let it happen if you could stop it." She didn't answer for a long time. The wire sang between my hands. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe I just couldn't ride past." "Both can be true," I said. She looked at me then. I could feel it, not see it, and I let it sit there because there wasn't anything I needed to add to it. I should say here what she looked like when she wasn't covered in ash and moving fast. She wasn't beautiful in the way a word like that gets used. She didn't look like a woman from a painting or a photograph in a shop window. She looked like weather. She looked like something real. Her face was angular with strong cheekbones, and the skin at the corners of her eyes had been creased by squinting into sun and wind until it stayed that way even in shade. She had a habit when she was thinking of pressing her lips together just slightly, like she was making a small decision. Her hands were capable. Not rough in a bad way, just in the way that hands get when they've done a great deal of useful things. I noticed these things the way you notice a particular stretch of country once you've ridden it a few times, and you find yourself looking for the same landmarks without meaning to. I was doing something I'd told myself for 8 years I wasn't going to do again. I didn't know then whether to be frightened of it or grateful. She'd been there 3 weeks when the trouble came. A man named Bircham rode in on a Thursday afternoon. He was broad through the shoulders and wore his hat at an angle that said something about himself that I recognized and didn't like, and he had 2 men with him that could have been worse, but were certainly bad enough. He said he was looking for a woman named Nora Birch. I was at the half-built cabin wall with Sam Briggs and one of Sam's boys, and we came down off the scaffold together, and I said, "Who's asking?" "Delmer Bircham," he said. "She worked my ranch up in Cedar County 3 seasons back, left owing wages." It was a lie. The way he said owing was the way a man says owing when what he means is something else entirely, something he has a claim on that he shouldn't have. And I'd heard that particular tone before in the voices of men who thought a woman alone was a thing they had some right over. Nora had heard the horses. She came around the far side of the lean-to, and she saw him, and she went very still. Not afraid, still, held still like she was deciding. I said, "This woman's a guest on my property and has been for 3 weeks. Any business you have with her, you state it here and you state it plain." Bircham looked at me with the eyes of a man who was calculating something. He was calculating whether I was the kind of problem he wanted to make or the kind he could push past. I let him calculate. Sam Briggs shifted his weight on my right. Sam was 60 years old and had been working cattle since he was a boy in Kansas, and he had a particular stillness when he was deciding to be useful. He shifted his weight in the way that meant he'd already decided. Bircham looked at his 2 men, back at me. "I'll be passing through again," he said. "You'll be welcome when you've got something honest to say," I said. "Until then, you're on my land, and I'd like you off it." He left, they all left. Sam said quiet, "I know that name. Bircham has a place up past the Gallatin, not a place women generally leave of their own accord." That night after supper, Nora told me, "I won't put it all down here because it isn't mine to put down. What I will say is that Delmer Bircham was the reason she'd left, the reason she was heading to her sister's place in Harlow, the reason she kept her knife where she could reach it fast, the reason that rope burn on her right hand looked like it had been put there by someone else and not by accident." I listened. I didn't ask questions. I let her tell what she wanted to tell. When she was done, she said, "I'm not asking you to be involved in it." I said, "You didn't have to ask. You pulled my father out of a burning house. You've been helping me build. You sat with him when he needed sitting with. Whatever you're carrying that you came in here carrying, we're carrying it now." She looked at me in the firelight. My father was asleep behind us. The new walls of the cabin were rough pine, and they smelled good of cut wood and pine sap, and the lean-to was still up for when we needed it. There was a half-moon. "You don't know me that well," she said. "Well enough," I said. She pressed her lips together. "That small decision." "Bircham doesn't stop," she said. "Neither do I said. He came back 8 days later with a paper. "Some kind of document," he said, "from a judge in Cedar County. He had 2 new men with him, and he was carrying himself like a man who had bought permission to do what he was going to do anyway." I'd sent Sam to McGuire's Crossing 2 days earlier with a letter to the circuit judge there, a man named Aldridge who I'd played cards with once and found to be straight. Aldridge sent a deputy back with Sam, a young man named Prest who didn't say much but wore his badge straight and his gun straight, and that was enough. Bircham didn't expect Prest. He didn't expect what happened when Prest looked at the paper and said, calmly, that the judge who'd signed it wasn't sitting that circuit and hadn't been for 2 years, and that if Bircham had an honest claim, he was welcome to file it with the court in McGuire's Crossing and wait on it to be heard. Bircham's face went through several things in a short time. I watched it from the porch of the not-quite-finished cabin, where my father was sitting in a chair he'd made himself out of the lumber scraps, because the first thing he'd built when he felt well enough was a chair. I watched Bircham decide that the calculation had come out wrong and that today was not the day. He left. He left ugly, with words that I won't repeat because they aren't the point, and Prest watched him go and shook his head once and then rode after them to make sure they cleared the county line. My father said from his chair, "Man like that doesn't stop at one try." "No," I said. "You planning on being here when he comes back?" I looked at my father. He was looking at the road where Bircham had been. "I'm planning on this being my land," I said, "and on everyone on it being safe on it." He nodded like I'd confirmed something. The cabin went up through August. It was the 3 of us, mostly, Sam and his boy for the heavy work. But day to day it was me and Nora and my father watching from his chair, and sometimes getting up and doing things he shouldn't have been doing yet because he was Everett Cal and convalescence went against his grain. I came to know her in the way you come to know someone you work beside, not through big statements, through small things, the way she handed a tool already turned right way around so you could take it and use it without adjusting, the way she read weather, the way she was with the horses, which tells you as much about a person as anything. She was direct with them, confident, and they responded to it. She told me about the mountains sometimes, about the trappers her father had known and the Crow people he'd traded with, and the winters that were nothing like any winter I'd seen in this country, cold enough to kill thought. She'd survived things. You could see it the way you see a fault line in good rock. The rock is stronger for what it went through, not weaker, but the history is in it. I told her about Della. Not right away. Maybe the second week of August, on an evening when we'd gotten the roof beams up and we were sitting on what would be the porch, and the light was doing that particular thing it does in late summer in this country, going amber and wide and slow. I told her about the winter, about the name we'd given the boy, about the 8 years after. She listened the way she did everything, with her full attention and no comment that wasn't needed. She said, "You're not a man who talks about that much." "No," I said. "Why now?" I thought about it. I suppose because you told me things, and because I stopped. "Because what?" "Because you seem like you'd rather know," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I would." Burcham came back in September. He didn't ride in this time. He sent one of his men in the dark, and what that man did was set fire to the east side of the new cabin, the part I hadn't finished the siding on yet, with a torch he'd soaked in coal oil. I heard the horse's Duster, who I kept in the corral close to the cabin now, and I was out with a rifle before the fire had caught well. Nora was right behind me, 3 steps, with the other rifle I'd set by the door for exactly this. The man on horseback turned and ran, and I put a shot over his head, not to drop him, just to tell him something about who he was running from, and he ran hard. The fire we got out. The siding was gone on 2 posts, and one corner beam was charred, but the structure held. My father came out in his long underwear with a bucket. I said, "Pa, I've got it." He said, "I can see you've got it," and threw the bucket on the fire anyway. Nora was already refilling it at the pump. After we had it down, my father went back inside, and I stood there in the dark with the smell of char and the sound of the horses settling, and Nora stood beside me. Not behind me, beside me, with the rifle at her side. I said, "This isn't your fight." She turned and looked at me. The moon was up by now, and I could see her face clearly. She said, "Cade." "Yeah." "When did it stop being my fight and start being yours?" I didn't have an answer for that. She said, "I was going to keep moving. I had Harlow to get to. I had a sister I hadn't seen in 3 years. I made a choice to stay, and it wasn't because I needed somewhere to hide, and it wasn't because I didn't have anywhere else to go." She paused. "It was because this is worth staying for." The night was quiet around us. Somewhere south of the bluffs, a coyote was saying something to the dark. "I'm not saying that to put something on you," she said. "I'm saying it so you know." "All right," I said. She looked at me for another moment. "All right," she said. "It means something to me," I said. "That you stayed, that you're here, it means a considerable amount." She nodded, then she turned back toward the cabin. I stood there in the yard for another minute, in the smell of char and pine and the particular cold that comes off the land at 3 in the morning in September, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was that I was not running from anything. That I was standing still, right where I was supposed to be, and it was all right. We sent word to Harlow. The sister, her name was Frances, wrote back in 2 weeks. She was glad Nora was safe, and she said in the letter that she'd hoped for years Nora would find somewhere to put her feet down, and she sounded like a woman who meant it. The law in Cedar County had finally taken an interest in Burcham. Prest had done good work, made the right connections, sent the right letters. There was a warrant issued in October. Burcham crossed into Nevada before it could be served and didn't come back, at least not that I ever heard. My father finished his chair and started making a table. The cabin went up all the way, straight walls, sound roof. I put in a double chimney, which my father said was extravagant and then spent a week saying was the right way to do it. We had walls and glass in the windows before the first real cold came down out of the north. On a Thursday in October, in the last week of warmth before the weather turned. I was splitting wood behind the cabin and Nora came around the corner and sat on the chopping round and watched me work. I said, "Something on your mind?" She said, "Francis says there's work in Harlow. A man named Greer who runs the general store needs help through winter." I set them all down. I looked at her. "Is that what you want?" I said, "to go work in a general store in Harlow?" She looked at her hands. The rope burn on her right hand was something I knew now, the weight of that history. She said, "I don't know what I want. I know what I have here. I know what this is." "What is it?" I said. She looked up at me, no hedge in it. "It's the first place I've been in 20 years that I didn't want to leave." I picked up the maul and set it against the stump. I said, "Then don't." She said, "It's not that simple." "I know it isn't," I said. "Nothing worth having is, but I'm asking you plain. You've been here 4 months and my father talks to you like your people, which he doesn't do with most people. And I stopped and started again. I've been awake more mornings than I can count since you've been here, not anxious, awake, like there's something worth getting up for." I looked at her. "I'd like to go on having that." She was very still. I said, "I'm not asking you to give up Harlow or Francis, or whatever you had in mind when you were riding north. I'm asking you to consider that this might be worth as much as any of that." She said, "You know what I'm carrying." "I know what you've told me. I expect there's more. That's the same for anybody." "I'm not easy," she said. "No," I said. "You're not. You're plain and you're direct and you've got a long memory and you hold your own counsel and you don't ask for help. You can take care of yourself. That's not easy, but it's not bad either." She looked at me for a long time. She stood up from the chopping round. She walked over to me and she put her hand on my chest, flat, sure, no hesitation in it, and she looked up at my face with those dark, weather-worked eyes and she said, "I stayed once before Bircham came back. I stayed after." I didn't say anything because I was waiting to see if you were real. And I said, "You're real," she said. "You're about as real as it gets." I put my hand over hers. Her hand was warm from the sun and her fingers were calloused, and I held on to them. "Then stay," I said. She said I was already going to. My father finished the table in November. It seated 4, which was 2 more than he'd ever needed before, and he said nothing about that, but he built it so it could seat 4, and I noticed, and I didn't say anything either because some things you don't need to say. Nora wrote Francis in Harlow and Francis wrote back that she was not surprised, and that she'd come visit in spring, which she did, and which is another story entirely. What I know is this. Winter came hard that year, down from the north in the last week of October, and by November the bluffs were white and the cattle were pulled in close to the feed grounds, and the days got short the way they do, where you're working in the dark at both ends. My father sat by the double chimney that he'd called extravagant, and that kept the whole cabin warm as bread and said nothing about it. On a morning in December, before first light, I came in from checking on the horses and Nora was at the stove. The cabin smelled of coffee and wood smoke. My father was still asleep. The light from the stove threw her shadow long across the floor. She turned when she heard the door and handed me the cup she'd already poured, and her face in that firelight was the same face it always was, no performance in it. No angle, just her, plain and weathered and real. I took the cup. She turned back to the stove. Outside, the snow was still coming down and the horses were warm in the barn, and the walls of that cabin, straight and sound, nothing extra, nothing wasted, were holding against everything the weather had to say about it. I drank my coffee. That was enough, that was everything,